Hi, this is Mike Gant, and today this video is episode 28 of Bible Mechanics. And today I wanted to talk to you about the chapter and verse divisions in the Bible. And to do that, I thought it would be useful if I read from a essay that I wrote on my website, which you can find access to in the information box beneath this video. The title is The Chapter and Verse Divisions Post-Date the Authors by Over 1,000 Years. The chapter and verse divisions we see in our Bibles were not part of what the authors originally wrote. These markers were added to the Bible centuries later as navigational aids, just as latitude and longitude lines were added to globes as navigational aids. The last Bible texts were written in the 1st century. But the chapter divisions were not added until the 13th century, and the verse divisions were not added until the 16th century. Aren't you glad we live in the 21st century? I know I am. As latitude and longitude lines help mariners communicate with each other about various specific locations on the earth, so chapter and verse divisions help Bible readers communicate with each other about where a certain sentence is located in the Bible. Instead of saying, the prophet Isaiah wrote a couple of times about the new heavens and the new earth near the end of his book, we can say, the prophet Isaiah wrote about the new heavens and the new earth in Isaiah 65:17 and 66:2. Such notations save time, facilitate communications, and foster the spreading of the knowledge and wisdom that we find in the Bible. The Bible is not unique in this regard. Other texts, and not just religious ones, that are widely studied have been similarly overlaid with chapter and verse divisions. The purpose is always the same, to make it easier and more productive for people to share their thoughts on writings they deem important. Although we greatly benefit from the Bible's chapter and verse divisions, we must keep in mind that chapter divisions do not communicate anything to us from the author's mind. It is only natural for our minds to assume that a change of chapter indicates that the author is taking a breath before taking his next step in thought, because this is the way modern books are written. But this is not the way that any of the books in the Bible were written, or any ancient books for that matter. Those who originally determined where the chapter boundaries were to be drawn in the Bible probably tried to follow the perceived contours of the author's thoughts. That said, the authors were prophets and apostles, that is, divinely appointed to write. But the chapter divisions were undertaken by regular men like us, and it is not always easy to find the seams, as it were, in the writing that would call for a chapter division. In other words, assigning chapter divisions was not a divinely appointed task like being named a prophet or an apostle. It's a human judgment call. A prophet or an apostle can say, "Thus saith the Lord," but a chapter and verse marker is not the Lord speaking to us. Why am I focusing on the chapter and verse divisions in the Bible? Well, though it's not a frequent occurrence, there are occasions where you or I might divide this chapter from that chapter differently from what we see on the page. For example, I see Matthew 3:16 and 17 being tied as closely in thought with Matthew 4:1 through 11 as it is with Matthew 3:13 through 15. In other words, I see the section could go with what comes before it or what comes after it. I say this because Satan's temptations of Jesus described in Matthew 4:1 through 11 are based on the voice out of the heavens identifying Jesus as God's Son in Matthew 3:16 through 17. The devil was hissing, if you will, if you are the Son of God. The if was intended to make Jesus doubt his identity as God's Messiah. This is a very important point, for it reveals how Satan tempts us to doubt the Lord. So I would not have put a chapter division between Matthew 3:16, 17 on the one hand and Matthew 4:1 through 8 on the other. But this does not necessarily mean the chapter divider put it in the wrong place. Maybe he saw things the same way I did, but could find no better place to put the division. Who am I to try to correct his work? It's not practical or necessary for us to revisit the chapter divisions of the Bible. It's only necessary for us to remember that just as we don't see latitude and longitude lines on the ground when we walk around on the earth, neither were the chapter divisions we see in our Bible present in the author's minds when they wrote her chapter and verse. The navigational dividing lines we've been given for both the earth and the Bible are very useful and do not need to be altered. They just need to be used for their intended purpose and no more than that. The conclusion is, whenever you start reading a chapter of the Bible, simply think for a moment about how its material might connect to material from the previous chapter. And sometimes, sure enough, you'll say, well, wow, this first sentence of this chapter really goes better with the last chapter, and the break would have been better coming somewhere else. But again, to compare them to latitude and longitude lines, that's like confusing those lines with a nation's borders or boundaries. If the boundary of a nation is following a river path, it's not going to line up with either a latitude or a longitude line, and so we got the same situation here. So it's just distinguishing a navigational system from what it is you're trying to navigate. So distinguish the chapter and verse divisions from what you're trying to read and understand in the Bible. Can you imagine how much longer it took for the ancients to communicate this? The Bible was written from, say, beginning around 1500 BC all the way through the end of the 1st century AD. And then it was over 1,000 years later before they even had chapter divisions, and then another 300 years after that before they had the verse divisions. And then there's the red letters for Jesus' words, but that's the subject of another video. God bless.